When we look at this week, you've got President Biden talking about freedom and the fight against tyranny, both 80 years ago and today. And then you've got Donald Trump talking about how revenge is justified. Let's talk to us about where these two campaigns are and where they appear to be headed.
Tyranny of the past and tyranny of the present is basically what we're talking about. Where are they heading? Sometimes I honestly look at these two things and I think, will this election simply come down to, will Trump have more disillusioned people that won't show up? Or will Biden have more disillusioned people that won't show up? And that scares me, because I feel like for those of us doing the work, who in the streets every day, defending people's freedoms, if Trump wins again, what we're facing is no dissent. And with no dissent, we can't challenge any of it.
But if he wins again, there's no surprises about who Donald Trump is, right? In 2016, you could make the argument people don't realize who he is, right? Remember, you had all of these people who were, no, you don't realize what you're in for. America knows exactly what they're in for. You say no.
There seems to be a lot of delusion, right? We hear a lot about, the Trump year was great. The Trump administration was great, as if COVID just didn't happen. And there's some reason that those last 2 years just don't count against his record.
I don't remember COVID, but I definitely remember Infrastructure Week.
Right, Infrastructure Week was every week. I feel like Trump is the most selfish person in the world, and everything redounds to how it revolves around me personally. Every political issue comes back to me, myself. This reporter asked him, Katie from Alabama wants to know, what's your relationship with God? And he said, I do very well with the evangelicals. That is not the question you were asked. And Biden, to me, seems very outward, right? He's thinking about others. How can I help other people? You think about the key moment of his life, like losing a major chunk of his family in one horrific moment as a relatively young man, who learned empathy and to think about others and the importance of family. And this other person who, every bad characteristic we don't want our children to have, he has.
But I think what you said, what's the question being asked and what are we trying to answer, is instructive to what the Biden campaign, I believe, should be trying to do, which is framing this beyond even needing to pay attention to the news day to day. And it's more a choice between extremism and not. I just wonder why we're not generally describing Trump more as an extremist, right? Forget about... again, let's not forget, to Liz's point, about the issues, people on the ground doing good work. But when it comes to what are we expecting out of this, do you want someone who feels like they are attacking every institution, who is, again, do we need to recite the litany of felons and felonies? Let's just talk about not being that.
Okay, but here's possibly why I think why this is playing out. Because though they shouldn't be, President Biden is focusing voters on democracy and on freedom. And these are fundamentally important things, but somehow they get viewed as kind of lofty ideals, and Trump goes straight to the gut and grievance.
Because people don't know what it's like not to have it. I lived in Russia for 6 years. They didn't understand democracy. They didn't know what it was like not to be sort of, the possibility of randomly being arrested and otherwise having appeal. But can I just go back to the beginning of the show?
You can go wherever you want.
Did all that stuff in this montage happen just this week?
Yes.
And there's 151 days, which means 21 weeks, is my math right? I'm wondering if I have the stamina to make it to this, if this is just 1 week's worth of stuff. I really think this is going to be rather dramatic, caustic, and I think that Biden's going to have to really bring home what is the absence of democracy, which is a very tough thing, whereas Trump has only to sell, look, we can do all these things and everything can be great, and rule of law is not a significant thing that people think of.
We get with Trump a great salesman for his diseased ideas, okay? Biden has not yet shown himself to be a great salesman of his ideas, of what he's done. And there is a very significant and real and honest critique of Biden from the left, that he has not done enough on what's going on in Gaza. And there are a lot of people who would be Democrats otherwise who will not support him because of that.
Can I just, I hear you. What's the conversation to have with that voter about what former President Trump will do with the situation in Gaza? Was it not Nikki Haley a few weeks ago? What when she went over there and said, finish the job?
You know, what Liz said about the margins is important. Don't think about the potential, the imaginary hypothetical Biden-Trump voter. I don't think that person really exists, right? There's a couple, but not many. It's can
There's
Trump,
a lot.
The election is going to be about, can Trump get people who would say it's either Trump or I stay home? And can Biden get people who says either it's Biden or I stay home, right? That election is going to be won on those margins. And, you know, Biden does have this significant issue, right, that a lot of people, there's a meme going around right now on TikTok, I'm sure you've seen it, where
On
they
TikTok,
ask somebody,
home of misinformation
No.
central.
Slow down. We can talk about TikTok later, but
Okay, we can do that.
when they asked this man, gun to your head, would you vote for Biden or Trump? And he said the gun would go off. And that has become this meme that has been shared by people who are like, I won't go for any of them.
But this is my point about extremism versus not. Like, Biden should be also as popular as the field broadly, right? Do you want Trump or anybody else? We're at a point where Trump is not just specifically dystopian in the ways that we may remember or not, based on our experience during the pandemic. He's also just clearly against the rule of law as a concept. And so I think the question of democracy is, how do you make this a tangible, scarier thing? Because currently, I think talking about democracy as a concept is a little pie in the sky, right?
Okay.
I think about democracy dying in darkness. Didn't really work as a slogan for the Washington Post.
But this week, right, with the remembrance of D-Day, it wasn't just the stark contrast between President Biden and Donald Trump. It was also between Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan. Right, Ronald Reagan gave one of the most important speeches of his presidency in Normandy. Right, he stood against Russian aggression. He stood with his NATO allies. So, isn't there a question to ask of all Republican voters? Where has your party gone? Because the current GOP and what Donald Trump represents bears almost no resemblance to Ronald Reagan. It's why you saw Joe Biden looking almost Reagan-like and referencing him while he was in France this week.
I mean, I'm just not going to go down that path because I'm somebody who doesn't have friends who are alive because of Ronald Reagan's inaction around AIDS, right? So when I think about waxing back to the people who laid the foundations for this evolution, Trump didn't come to us in a vacuum. Trump came to us because people laid foundations for hatred and bigotry and sexism. And I feel like, so when we go, I don't want to go back to the party that I could recognize of Ronald Reagan. But what I do want to say is the people that we're leaving out in this conversation are the voters. I'm constantly saying to people, the election is not the end game. It's the starting game. You get the democracy you want, and you get the democracy you participate in. And who do you want to fight? That's my whole thing. Who do you want to fight? Do you want to fight a madman, or do you want to fight somebody who might listen to you where you can get the needle moved? Because these are our people.
I don't think the election is going to be won by Biden if he's making democracy his number one issue. I think it's got to be the economy. All of our polling shows people are most concerned about inflation. They're most concerned about jobs. They're most concerned about the economy. Democracy should be like the sprinkles you get with the ice cream cone. If the ice cream cone is the economy you get, I think he has to sell.
But without a functioning democracy, you can throw your economy out the window.
Agreed.
But the economy is always the number one issue.
Okay,
right?
hold on. Finish your thought.
Well, I was just gonna say that if he doesn't win it on the record that he is running on, and
which is a strong one,
which is a pretty strong one, and a vision of the future, I don't think he wins it saying, I'm the democracy guy and that guy isn't.
We're talking two different languages as far as the folks who may vote for Biden and the folks who may vote for Trump. We are not speaking to, I mean, this is not about issues at all. This is about personality.
Yes.
This is about who you believe, right? And the people on the right live, right? Joy Reid talks about Earth 1 and Earth 2, right? The people on the right live on Earth 2. And we can sit here and go, nothing that you believe is factual, right? I mean, we could go on and on, right? January 6th, climate change, the election, the trial. But they are affirmed in their misbelief constantly, and they think we don't know what's reality.
But this is why I feel like the whole felonies thing should and hopefully does cut through to a silent majority, not to evoke Reaganisms inadvertently, but a silent majority of people who are like, you know what, I'm an Earth One resident, but I'm just not that proud of it, you know? And it's like, for me, a bridge too far is when we have a convicted felon surrounded by felons being, again, in the White House. Like, I just feel like I want to simplify it down to, do you want the felony guy or anyone else?
And if Donald Trump
that's a great
wanted
question.
more than his base, wouldn't he be doing everything possible to court the Nikki Haley voter? He disrespected Nikki Haley in every possible way, yet still she endorsed him. Right? And if he actually wanted to win, wouldn't he say, she's my running mate, let's go for the gold? But he hasn't. Instead, it's President Biden this week who's putting together a coalition to try to go for those voters and risking losing progressive voters in the mix.
But I wonder, when we say Nikki Haley voter, like, I don't know that they were so psyched about Nikki Haley. I think they were just like, I don't want Trump. I'm not like, Nikki Haley, everything about Nikki Haley is just awesome. People weren't saying that, you know? And so I feel like him going for that voter after he saw that, we saw the numbers after Iowa, you know, was it 28% of those people said, if Nikki Haley's not the nominee, I could possibly vote for Biden. You know, that's, I think, when Trump doesn't go out and try to expand his base.
He never has.
He never does.
No. But let me finish. Why does he even doing that? You know, that should be the sign to everybody. He's not trying to expand past you. So he's not looking at a world for you.